Greetings, and welcome to Theology Thursdays. We begin a new endeavor this semester. One of the most asked clarifications is the relationship between faith and science. These two competing things, or at least that's what we are taught to believe that they are. And one of the things that is simply true about this question is that there are a lot of assumptions that go into the statement of a question like that. The relationship between faith and science is what we're going to be exploring, but it is not unusual to find both within religious and within non-religious circles perhaps an assumption that faith and science are incompatible. One must have one or the other. One must choose between faith or science, not have a relationship between faith and science. This is so common, at least within the Christian West here in the United States. The thing is, though, is that this doesn't come from nowhere, and this assumption of faith versus science is something that is deeply ingrained in not simply the scientific community and not simply the religious community, but within the culture of the United States itself. What we're going to be doing today is setting up why this conversation between faith and science that John Polkinghorne is going to give us in our book is so incredibly important. And we're going to start with a little bit of history. The relationship between faith and science really is birthed out of a certain kind of Protestantism, at least for us within the United States. We're not really going to be treating a lot of Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox thoughts on this because most likely we are all coming from a background of Protestantism in general. And the reason why it's important to get our grasp underneath this is because there are certain religious movements within the history of the United States subsequently, as both the history of the United States and the westward expansion of the European colonizers happen, but also within the religious happenings of the fervor of the Great Awakenings. Now, the Great Awakenings in the history of religious movements in the United States primarily are prizing the personal experience of God and the personal salvation over and against a more kind of communal aspect to this. It is my personal relationship with Jesus, things like that, but also a prizing of faith, the faith fervor of someone over and against anything to the contrary. Now again, there are some deep biblical reasons for this. Faith is the assurance of those things that we don't see, that we don't observe. This is true, but this has to also be pitched in counterbalance to another philosophical movement that arguably is also at the root of the American project, the United States project, which is the philosophical movement called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment prized above all else the observance of the physical universe, and that any sort of quote-unquote revealed truth was either, in some cases, just simply held up as simply a human explanation of certain things that we did not have the explanatory ability to describe in the phenomena, such as the movements of planets, the existence of the movement of the Earth relative to the sun, things like that. And the reason why this is important to understand is because Enlightenment rationalism, the prizing of the reason above as the objective rather than faith, is a movement that happens in contrast but also in complement to the rise of faith over and against rationalism. In other words, if you really believed in Jesus, you would not prize your logic and your physical observance of the universe above what the Word of God said. And we see where this kind of gets into a little bit of some thorny stuff. It really takes off in the 1800s. And at least for us within the West, this really takes off when it comes to the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Now, what's going to be pointed out, as you're going to find out, is that you will be surprised that those with the non-religious background, there were some who were highly critical of Charles Darwin's Origins of Species, but you will also be interested to know that there were religious types, specifically Christian religious, that were very excited about the origin of species and saw this as not incompatible with the way that we understand Holy Scripture and inspiration of God. And so the thing is that to paint too much of a black and white between evolution versus faith is not exactly true to the history. And in fact, if you kind of read throughout how that history of dialogue between the biological sciences and faith happened, you'll also know that there were some hugely important people who were not only people of faith, but who were also clergy within the Christian church that contribute to these theories that happen. Not to mention the father of modern genetics, a monk by the name of Gregor. And so the thing is that there's not really this sort of harsh break between these things. However, there is a deep conceptual tradition that we have to reconcile. And whenever you take the approach that these two things don't mix, you simply lose the dialogue between them. And the kind of culmination of all of this can be seen in the response to the 1800s rationalism by the publication of a series of documents called the Fundamentals in the early 20th century. This, by the way, is where we have the word fundamentalism come from. However, the modern use of the word fundamentalism is wildly different than the way that the fundamentals themselves were trying to describe things. By the way, the fundamentals and the papers published during the fundamentals were also written by Anglicans as well. So it's not as if there is one church that is all about science and things like that, and one church that's not. No, it's that the discussion of the relationship between the physical sciences and faith and religion is one that has a storied and somewhat antagonistic history. But the culture wars that arise around this particular issue are kind of popularly seen as it comes to, let's say, the Scopes monkey trial of the 20th century. You have obvious religious overtones that are kind of underneath the and undergirding the bolstering of this faith here and versus science here. These these evil rationalists on this side and these faithful Christians on this side. Not as simple as it looks, and also not as simplistic as the history might make it seem on some points in time. This particular thing arises very importantly as we get to the 1970s and 1980s, in which we have somewhat of a rebirth of biblical studies, theological studies that are talking to each other again. So what biblical studies is saying and what theological studies are saying are beginning to reintegrate. As a couple of historians have pointed out, during the rise of the Enlightenment, even the university faculties of biblical studies and theological studies were sometimes separated. One studying ancient texts over here, and one studying the theory of theology over on this other side, a separation of the humanities, so to speak. But during this time of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and on to now, we see a renewed interest in re-engaging in biblical and theological studies, but in a way that is, perhaps to some people surprising, a re-emphasis on what exactly we mean by the Bible as being inspired, what exactly we're meaning by the study of the physical sciences, and also how exactly our rational reason in all of these studies has to do with the way that the Bible is to be understood and how science is to be understood. And one of the great bridges between these two things and the dialogue that happens is John Polkinghorne. John Polkinghorne was a physicist for a number of years. He actually was the chair of one of the mathematics departments and leaves his chair and is ordained as an Anglican priest. Of course, he's going to go into detail in his book here a little bit about where that comes from, but one of the things that is helpful about Polkinghorne's understanding is that over and against this conception that science and faith, you have to choose between these two, that Polkinghorne says, no, there is a much more nuanced, much more important dialogue between these two places in which neither faith nor the physical sciences are diminished, but rather they both complement a holistic view of the truth of what the world is. Because if you think about it, religious observance, particularly in the Christian tradition, is concerned with the truth of the reality of the world. When we say that Jesus was raised in a resurrection so that we might also be raised in a resurrection like his, that is not a metaphorical claim. That is a claim about the truth of the universe. It has just as much to do about the atoms of our body and the makeup and composition of our human beingness, of the species of what we are and what the world is, as it does to the spiritual import of those things. There's not a bifurcation between the spiritual and the physical. But also, at the same time, there is something seriously to be said about the way that our human understandings of the world have changed and adjusted. For example, we wouldn't say that there's anything within Holy Scripture that is sort of trying to describe the nature of the universe beyond what the creation stories are trying to tell us about the physical world. There was no need to do so. There was no need to be able to get to the minute details as to what makes up the physical composition of the universe. What is an atom? How does quantum theory of the universe interact with the way that we experience it? What are the theories of the orbit of the stars, and why can we explain these things using the physical sciences? Because the Bible is not a science textbook. Rather, the scriptures are trying to do something particular, but both of them have to do with the claims of truth. In other words, the Bible is claiming truth in the same way that the physical sciences claim to truth. They both are not separated from each other, but the way that they are getting at these things are distinct from each other, but pertain to the holistic view that we are trying to pursue. An example, perhaps, is helpful in this. When I take John Polkinghorne's book, which is what we're going to be studying, Questions of Truth, and I take this book and I drop it. It dropped and hit the floor. I can say that I have dropped that book onto the floor. I have placed the book up, I've let go with my hands, and it has fallen to the floor. Now, there are questions that arise out of exactly what is going on. Why would I take a book and drop it on the floor? The question why is one in which I now have to explain the why as to this book dropping to the floor in ways that are meaning creating. I am needing to describe in a meaningful fashion, and I use that word very, very importantly, meaningful fashion. I need to describe the meaning of what I just did. And the meaning of what I just did is to provide an explanatory for the scientific description of what just happened. The what just happened is that I held the book up and I dropped it, but the what is also more complex than that. I have an action of gravitational pull that is pulling this book, this object, down towards the floor. But even using the word down towards the floor is assuming that I am relative to the earth. Down is this way, up is that way. The ground is this way, the sky is that way. Except that relative to what? If I was standing on the surface of the moon, the place where I dropped this book would be completely relative to the earth, not to the moon, right? So the way that science is describing things is a descriptive what, an explanation as to the whats of the world. But if you were to ask me, why did you drop the book? That is a particularly different question. One of which, as John Polkinghorne is going to say, science is not built to answer. Science is not merely built to give all kinds of answers to everything, and one particular is the question of meaning. This is why existentialism is one of the arising things that happens out against rationalism. And we'll talk about what these things mean in more specific detail. But suffice to say, when we are talking about the description of the whats of the world, this is where scientific inquiry is very helpful. What caused my book to drop? Well, gravitational pulls. Well, what is gravity? We can get into that sometime later. But when I ask why did I drop the book? That is a question of meaning. That is a question of what am I trying to communicate to you? What am I trying to mean by the dropping of this book? If you knew something about me, you might be able to draw some inferences as to why I dropped the book. Given a vacuum, someone dropping a book or throwing a book across one's desk and to the side might mean a disgust with the book. I disagree with the book. I do not like the book. Except that, as I have already offered, that's not why I dropped the book. Why I dropped the book was to illustrate something. Illustrate a meaningful way of describing the truth of the world. Because the truth is, the book was dropped. The book was dropped in a way that both is descriptive physically by our scientific minds, by the logic of the universe, the laws of nature, as one might call it, but also is descriptive as to the existential value of what happened. Why did I drop this? Why is it that I just did this? What is the meaning that one is to be drawn out of this? Again, a very different way of describing that. And here is where the relationship between faith and science becomes very important. Because you need to have both of these in order to have a descriptive interaction with the physical world. Both of these operate on some level, bigger, smaller, more important, less important, but both of these are attempting to describe the truth of the world. And if we take that seriously, we should never see them as antagonistic to each other, but rather are simply ways in which we get at the truth of the world. Now, it is true that we have to make certain judgment calls as it comes to the relationship between these things, but again, this comes at another important point. Science is a method. It is not an agent. This is something that I believe Polkinghorne kind of implicitly talks about, but here is something to be on the lookout for. Whenever someone says, science said this, science caused this, science did that, as in fact I saw in a commercial recently, the personification of science into an agent, something that is determinative in and of itself, something that is determinative of truth at an objective fashion that does not need to be interpreted. The turning of science into a person is not entirely true to the way that we use science. Science, actually, in the very barest sense, is a philosophy born out of a reliable way that we can see the universe. But it is incorrect to say that science is its own actor. Science did something. No, that's not how it works. Science is a tool that we have to make certain judgment calls in order to say that there is an interpretation as to what happened. And this is where I'm going to leave off for our introduction, because this is where John Polkinghorne will immediately pick up. When we're talking about science and when we're talking about faith, we have to be really careful as to what questions we're asking. Which is why, as I pick up my book, we are looking at questions of truth. And of course the subline is 51 responses to questions about God, science, and belief. The questions that John Polkinghorne and Nicholas Beale, the editor, is going to be bringing out are going to be questions for inquiry, for thought, for reflection. And Polkinghorne is going to give his best assessment as to what the questions are. It might not be complete. It's not going to be exhaustive. There's suggestions for continued reading at the end of each chapter, but every question is laden with some deep assumptions that we have that Polkinghorne would like us to perhaps be a little bit more careful when we bring up these relationships in the future. But To bring us all the way back before we close for today, the reason why this is so important is because unless we are able to get a grounding as to what we're talking about when we talk about science and faith, we will never be able to, at least within the arguments of John Polkinghorne, understand the world in its fullness. The fullness of the world is something so far beyond our limited sight that it is good for us to use all of the tools that we have to our advantage. Science is simply one of those tools in which we use to understand something about the truth of the world, but it is not the only truth of the world. It is not the only descriptor of truth, which is why the language of faith is also essential. The language of faith is not optional, because everybody, no matter where they come from, have certain a priori or beforehand assumptions as to how the world works. And so very many of those, when we start drilling down into them, are not based upon simply logical conclusions, but actually are based upon faith leaps. They're based upon a completely appropriate leaps of faith. And this happens in both the secular and the sacred, in both those who are agnostic and those who are of a faith. And it is more appropriate to say that all of us make leaps of faith. All of us make assumptions about the way that the world works. All of us take positive truth about how we think the world works. The question is, do we have grounds to believe that? This is why we're going to be asking the questions of truth that John Polkinghorne and Nicholas Beale have put in front of us. This is where we will begin our study next week, as we come back to our new book, Questions of Truth, and as we dive into the far more nuanced and, at least in my opinion, far more exciting areas of the relationship between faith and science.